Hello and welcome to ChooseFI. Today on the show, we have a fun one. I want to really talk more about some advanced FI strategies from time to time. And I think it's important to spend the time and to focus on them because there are a lot of people in our community who are either at the point where they need to think about some of these advanced FI strategies, or they want to forecast down the road and say, oh, you mean I can do that? This superpower that we're always talking about, that extends there. And I think this particular one, which is the Roth IRA Conversion Ladder, is maybe the single most important. I know that's a bit audacious, but the single most important of our advanced FI strategies. And way back in the day, Jonathan and I attempted to tackle this on two different case studies. So we did episode 17R and episode 163R. And I think going back and listening to them, they do hold up, but they're very simplistic examples of how this strategy can work. So we didn't dive into all the nuance. We just gave you, okay, look, the ultimate question is, hey, a lot of people in the FI community, ChooseFI says, you really should try to max out your tax deferred retirement accounts on the path to FI. But how the heck do I access that money when I retire early, when I retire before 59 and a half? Isn't it all stuck there? And I think that's what we've tried to unpack recently. So we had Sean Mullaney on episode 475, and we talked about some strategies on overall how to access your retirement accounts before 59 and a half. But today I have my good friend Cody Garrett from Measure Twice Money. Cody's a CFP and the guy that I go to for these real in-depth calculations. He's just incredible. And what he prepared today to dive into the true nuance of the Roth IRA conversion ladder is going to blow your mind. I think this is a really important episode. And with that, welcome to ChooseFI. Cody, my friend, it is always good to see you. And I just want to say thank you from the entire ChooseFI community. You are a treasure. And I don't say that lightly. Like anytime I have a question, you're the guy I go to. You're just always so thoughtful and helpful. And it really, I always try to reference you. But sometimes even if I don't, like, man, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you. So thank you for being here.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. It's really funny looking back that when I joined ChooseFI, when I started listening to the podcast, I didn't know what an IRA was. And today I'm going to be teaching you and your audience in more detail, like the nuance of the order of operations for taking money out of not just IRAs, but Roth IRAs. So it's really cool to kind of, literally be starting with the basics with you and then just drinking out of the fire hose over the next 5 years. And now, thankfully, I'm able to give back, right? So form of gratitude is a way to, if I can give back to the community that's given so much to me, I'm always down for that.
That's incredible. And right, your background is, as I understand it, you were a musician, a professional musician at some point. And now, like you said, you came to ChooseFI knowing nothing. And now you are a CFP. You have an incredibly successful practice. You're not taking new clients. So like you always say, there's no conflict of interest. You're just here to give back. It's absolutely awesome. So I want to set the stage just real quick before you're going to probably talk 95% of this episode. I'm just going to kind of guide and shepherd a little bit. But how Jonathan and I tried to do this back in the day was to set up, like I said, the most simplistic version of this. And basically how we termed it, and I think the real beauty of this Roth IRA conversion ladder is as you focus on, okay, a way to access the money before 59 and a half. But what we focused on was if your expenses are under control enough as you're getting to FI. And there's a conceivable way that you could have all of these years been putting into tax deferred accounts, which means you got the tax deduction at the time with the understanding that, hey, when I pull this out someday, it's going to be a taxable event. I have to pay taxes on it. But what we've all determined with this strategy is if you keep your expenses low enough, which means you're pulling out only a fairly small amount, and we'll define that there's a chance you can pull most or all of your money out of your 401k, IRAs, et cetera, once they get funneled into IRAs, paying essentially zero in tax. And this is like the holy grail, in essence, of FI, right? So how can I plan ahead of time, in some cases, 15 years ahead of time, and set this up so I literally never pay tax on this? And there are some components of this, right? Because there's nuance, of course, in that yeah, you can make these Roth conversions, and you're going to talk in great depth about that, obviously. But there's a 5 year period before you can pull that money out, tax and penalty free. So basically, you need to bridge. And that's where this kind of ladder component comes in. You have to bridge those first 5 years because every year subsequent, you're going to be making another conversion. And once you get past the fifth year, the conversion from year zero, in essence, the one you did on day one, you can take out. So you have to bridge those first 5 years. And what that means for most of us is we need to have enough money saved up in our regular savings, or what we call our taxable brokerage accounts, which is such a terrible term, but nevertheless,
Right.
like to
I call them
cover.
taxable. They're taxable along the way, right?
Oh, that's cute. Not very pithy, but that's much more accurate. I like that. So taxable along the way. Yeah. So to cover those first 5 years. So basically, at a 50,000 foot view, you need to have 5 years of expenses saved up. And then you can really start taking advantage of, hey, every year I'm making this conversion. And because I'm at FI, my income is zero or close to zero. The only income I'm having is this conversion, which again is a taxable event. You're saying, government, please tax me. I'm pulling money out of my IRA. This is a taxable event. But because the standard deduction is so significant, you might have some other, maybe you have a child tax credit, depending on when you do this. Like there's a real chance you can do this and pay zero tax or a very, very, very minuscule effective tax rate on that money. So that's kind of how I would paint the picture. Again, at the most obvious 50,000 foot view. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, so I mean to back up a little bit, in the ChooseFI community and just on the path, think about, there's a path to financial independence and then there's a path through financial independence. And I think most of us that are listening, like we might be on the path too, right? We're trying to grab all this knowledge from different places, podcasts and the Facebook group and stuff. We're being very present and mindful, which is a great thing on average, right? We're thinking about what do I do? Like, what is my next step? Like, what is the next smallest action? And let's do that thing. But even though we get very mindful about the present year, which is a great, that's a great attribute in the ChooseFI community, we don't necessarily, as Stephen Covey would say, like begin with an end in mind. We defer this money, we defer this income by taking advantage of their workplace retirement accounts. We get that employer match, right? And the employer match is most likely pre-tax as well, right? So we're getting even more pre-tax money in. We're contributing to maybe HSAs, which we might talk about a little bit. We max out our Roth IRAs, whether with direct Roth IRA contributions or maybe doing using the backdoor, which I know you've talked a lot more about the backdoor Roth IRA contributions. But then we return, right? We return back to our pre-tax workplace retirement plans, those 401ks, 403bs, and we try to max those out. For example, right now, if you're under age 50, right, you can contribute $23,000 this year in 2024. So once you've maxed out your 401k, maybe your HSA, your Roth IRA, a lot of us, like, we're kind of running out of money to save and invest, right?
Right.
So we might not get to that last account in line, which is the taxable brokerage account. And even though the taxable brokerage is the last in line from a tax preference perspective in the current year, it's actually going to provide the most flexibility and control over taxable income in retirement. So we're doing ourselves a great favor today by taking advantage of, what Sean Mullaney calls, tax rate arbitrage, where you defer taxes at your higher rates and maybe distribute or convert them later at lower effective rates. But we also hurt ourselves by not planning for it. Wait a minute, if I do retire at 40 or 50, right, before 59 and a half, how the heck am I going to gain access to that money without getting hit by that 10% additional tax? And by the way, everybody calls it the 10% penalty. And did you know the IRS does not call it a penalty?
Really?
The IRS calls it an additional tax. And I think that we've been calling it a penalty, right? It conveys this idea that we're being punished for breaking the rules, right? So I think whether you're watching, somebody selling insurance on TikTok who's telling you like a 401k is a scam because you can never get your money out, keep in mind, like, it's your money. Once you roll that from a 401k into an IRA in the future, like, there's no trustee, it's just you, like, you control that account. But also, the only penalty or like the lack of access is really that you might have to pay an additional 10% tax if you take it out, that doesn't meet an exception. So today we're actually talking about one of the exceptions to the 10% penalty, 10% or additional tax, called the Roth IRA Conversion Ladder, which, by the way, is terminology we've made up within our community that's not actually. So don't look up the IRA publication on conversion ladders because it doesn't exist. Only within our community do we actually understand these more nuanced strategies.
Yeah, I love that. And it truly is an advanced strategy. And what's cool is, yeah, if you Google that, it's a real term, but it's largely a real term in our community. And now there are some other major personal finance sites that have picked it up. But yeah, it's an interesting strategy. And it is funny that that little nuance of, yeah, it's not a penalty, it's actually a tax. So, okay, let's just start there actually because that large question that you started with and I kind of stole at the beginning here is I've been maxing out my tax deferred retirement accounts on the path to FI. How can I access that money when I retire early? So now, just keeping with this, just the Roth IRA conversion. Let's assume you have money in a traditional IRA, okay? And you pull it out before 59 and a half and you don't convert it to a Roth IRA, you just utilize it.
Right.
So, like we've discussed, when you pull money out of a traditional IRA, it's a taxable event. So, the amount that you pull out, the gross amount that you pull out, goes on your tax return. Does anything else happen at that point other than that additional 10% tax?
No, there's only two parts to it. So if before 59 and a half, you take what's called a normal distribution, taking money from a traditional IRA and sending it to your taxable brokerage account or sending it to your bank account, there are two aspects. So the gross amount that you take out, assuming that all those contributions were made with pre-tax money, which is typical, right? That's usually a 401k or 403b that might have rolled over, into the IRA. There are two parts. So the gross distribution, all of that will be included in your taxable income. So let's say that somebody takes out $100,000 as a normal distribution into their taxable brokerage, into their bank account. That $100,000 will be included in your gross income on your federal and state tax return. But separate from your income tax, there's an additional tax of 10% on your early distribution that didn't meet an exception. Well, we'll talk about the exceptions. But one example, I'll just quickly run the calculator. So let's say a married couple filing jointly. Let's say they have no kids, just for simplicity. Their only source of income is taking $100,000 out of their traditional IRA as a normal distribution. So $100,000, their adjusted gross income is also the same in this case. So they have a standard deduction. So they don't have to itemize their deductions by, giving to charity or having mortgage interest or property taxes. This is just given to them. This standard deduction, they're going to get it automatically. So this family, by taking that distribution as their only form of income, they're going to receive the standard deduction this year in 2024 of $29,200, which brings their taxable income, which is an IRS term, taxable income, down to $70,800. That's within the 12% marginal tax bracket, which is kind of that second bracket you see on the tax brackets. So if I run that calculation for taxes owed, they will owe about $8,000 in federal income tax on that distribution of $100,000. So that's one part. That's their income tax. They owe about $8,000 on that 100,000 they took out, which is pretty nice, right? That they only paid 8% effectively on that 100,000 they pulled out. But we have to keep in mind that they took a normal distribution before they met the age requirement of 59 and a half. So there's a 10% penalty. And that 10% additional tax / penalty, I'll just call it a penalty for now on,
Yep.
because that's what we've been calling it. That 10% penalty applies not to their taxable income or their AGI, but it actually applies to how much they took as a normal distribution. So they're actually paying $8,000 in federal income tax, but they're also paying $10,000 as an additional tax on their distribution before 59 and a half. So of the 18,000 they're paying in taxes, 10,000 of that came from taking that normal distribution before they
Right.
got to that age.
Okay, that's super interesting. So, right, it is just straight on the actual distribution. So, right, whereas the calculation normally goes through, like you said, taxable income with the standard, and we're saying these people have no kids, so they don't have child tax credits. In essence, this is 18% effective tax rate on these people because they're paying 18,000 total on a $100,000 distribution. So,
Right.
still, while I suspect there are better ways to do this, that's not that horrific. So, when we have that original question of how the heck do I access this money? Like the absolute worst case scenario is you just pay the darn penalty, really extra tax, and it's not so bad. You're probably actually paying less than most people fear in their mind's eye.
Right. And also, it's really funny to think about a lot of people who are doing the strategy were actually deferring that income at the 22, 24 or higher tax brackets. So even with the penalty, even with the
Yeah.
10% penalty, they could actually still be distributing it at a lower tax rate.
That is fascinating. And what's interesting here, and I know, like I said, you spent a lot of time preparing this, and you prepared this example based on a couple with $100,000 of annual expenses, which frankly, is pretty high, right?
Right.
Especially, which
On average.
but it's cool, Cody. Like it makes it a more effective
Mm,
example because honestly, for a lot of people who are at FI, their expenses are almost by definition going to be less than 100,000. I mean, that's $8,000 plus per month. A lot of people have their mortgages paid off at that point. Like $8,000 a month with a mortgage paid off is rolling in money, right? So, like,
right.
realistically, for most people, it's going to be dramatically less than that. I know way back when in our examples, we use like 40 or 50,000, essentially half of your example. And you're much closer to 0%, Ben, which is kind of cool. But even worst case, you're paying 10% penalty, quote unquote, on that $40,000 distribution. That doesn't look so bad, so it's an interesting thought. And I love that you started it with the 100,000.
Yeah, and what you said, right? If they had taken a distribution of 50,000 instead of 100,000 with no kids, they'd have a 4% effective tax rate before the penalty, so 14
Right.
total. If they had one child, guess what? They're only paying the penalty but no other, only 10%, right? So with multiple kids, like they're only going to be paying the additional tax as their only form of tax.
Does the child tax credit count against this? Since this is technically tax, I wonder that might be, we'd have to mock that up in like
Yeah, yeah,
TurboTax or something. I don't think that's something either of us would know off the top of our head. But what's interesting, right? And I don't know if the child tax credit is refundable, actually. That's another thing that would render this moot anyway. But
yeah,
nevertheless,
probably not worth mentioning, but yeah, that could really get
and
crazy.
that's what's funny is there's always
Yeah,
stuff to dive into. So anyway, total sidebar, but I think it's just kind of fun as we spin this out since we are talking advanced FIs to really think about this. So okay, I think we've done enough of the setup, and I think this has been
sure.
really really critical. But let's dive in. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start here is with understanding if it's called a Roth IRA conversion ladder. First of all, we have to understand we're taking money out of a Roth IRA. So before we get to the ladder part, I think it's really important to understand how money is distributed or withdrawn from a Roth IRA because there's actually an order of operations. There's three different things that are taken out of a Roth IRA. We kind of think of as our Roth IRA as one big pot of money, but there are the direct contributions we made, right? There are those backdoor contributions we made. Those are kind of in bucket one. The second bucket are taxable Roth conversions, which we'll talk about in more detail today. And then the third is the earnings on those contributions and conversions. So today we're primarily going to be talking about the second bucket, which is the taxable Roth conversions. So just before we get too deep there, you might be asking, wait a minute, don't go too fast there, right? So the contributions you make directly to a Roth IRA while working, right? You have to have earned income to contribute directly. This year in 2024, that's $7,000 per person, under age 50. I actually looked at a kind of interesting stat here that if you had been maxing out your Roth IRA over the past 10 years, those contribution limits have changed a little bit over the time, but if you've contributed the max to a Roth IRA over the past 10 years, each person has contributed $59,500 to the Roth IRA. So that's separate from the earnings, just how much you put in. What's nice about that, you can kind of start thinking about it. Wait a minute, if you're married, maybe both of you have done this, like that's double, that's over $100,000 put into the Roth IRA. When you take money out of a Roth IRA, the IRS actually lets you take out the amount that you put in directly without penalty, without tax, at any age, for any reason, right? So the money you put in directly, you can take out at any age, for any reason, without tax or penalty.
And that is critical. So, right, this is regular contributions made to a Roth IRA. You can pull out tax and penalty free at any time. And the reason why just simply is because by its very nature, the Roth IRA is after tax money. So you've already paid tax on it and then you contributed it to the Roth IRA, which is why a Roth IRA grows and is never taxed again because it's already been taxed on the front side. So that's what's cool about this is they're basically saying, hey, you've already been taxed on it. You've made this contribution. You can actually pull that contribution out at any time, which is distinct from the earnings. So that's
Right.
critical. But keeping track, like you said, that 59,500 or whatever it was, if you did it for the last 10 years, those are regular contributions to the Roth IRA. Any portion of that can be pulled out tax and penalty free in the future.
Right. And that's the best place to start because knowing that, we might initially think, wait a minute, in retirement, in early retirement, what if I convert money from my traditional IRA to my Roth IRA? So you say, oh, well, maybe I'll pay the taxes to move it to the Roth IRA, but then I'll just take it out of the Roth IRA because it's available at any time, right? Wrong. The IRS, so this is where the ladder is even like created. The IRS has this rule. If you implement a taxable Roth conversion from a traditional account to a Roth account, they're not going to let you take that money out of the Roth IRA immediately without tax or penalty. They're going to make you wait 5 tax years per conversion before you can take that money out. Again, you've already paid taxes on that amount that you converted, but you cannot take that amount out without the 10% penalty before 59 and a half unless you've waited 5 years per conversion. So if you visualize this, if you're kind of following along in your head here, every 5 years, that means that if I do a conversion this year, it's going to have to bake for 5 years before I can touch it without penalty. Then next year, I'll do a conversion. That's going to have to bake 5 years, right? So this ladder, these rungs that we're kind of introducing, that, there's one this year, one next year, one the next. These ladders like slowly, quote unquote, mature, but only 5 years in the future. Thankfully, the Roth conversion ladder like doesn't have to go forever. It's not like an endless ladder, right? This ladder thankfully can end at 59 and a half. But this whole concept of this ladder comes from the idea that if you convert from a traditional account to a Roth account, you have to wait 5 years to get that portion that you converted out without the penalty.
Yeah, and I love this. I want to slow down real quick just to make sure everybody understands this, because actually we started here talking about the Roth IRA and the ways to pull money out of it. But astute listeners are saying, hey guys, you set this whole thing up and talked about the tax deferred money, which how do I get that out and access it when I retire early, right? So again, for the astute listener, we're actually talking about the whole strategy here is how do you take money from your 401k, your traditional IRA, 403b, et cetera, and get that out. But yet we started here with the Roth IRA. So I think the intersection is this second part, this bullet number 2 here. And I think, Cody, this is so important. I love how you said this is where the ladder comes in, because ultimately, why do we not do this all in 1 year? Right. So the question is, okay, I have money in a 401k and I left my job, then I roll it into, let's say, a rollover IRA. So that's something that now I control, but it still retains the character of that pre-tax contribution, right? So it's a traditional IRA at that point. Now, couldn't I do this all in one fell swoop? Couldn't I take the $1 million that I have in this IRA and do that? And your answer to that very obviously is
absolutely, you could, but you shouldn't.
Right. And it's because of the graduated income tax bracket and our entire US tax system. So again, this is you driving this, but I think it's important so people understand, like, we mentioned the term effective tax rate, but I think people sometimes don't really understand tax brackets. They sometimes think, oh, I went into the next tax bracket. That means all of my dollars are at this. It doesn't work that way. So there's an interplay here that I think we need to slow down on.
Yeah, I think, in that example of taking $1 million out in 1 year, there's two aspects. One is that, again, that $1 million very, very quickly maxes out those early brackets, like the 10%, 12%, this progressive tax system. So any taxable income for a married couple that exceeds 731,000 will be taxed at that 37% tax bracket, right? So you can see that like a big portion, like 300,000 of the million is actually taxed at the highest rate. Whereas if you had split it up, had you done it over multiple years, you can refill up those smaller brackets. There's a second part to this too that, some people like this idea of ripping off the Band-Aid. I'm just going to convert all of it in 1 year and who cares if you even pay the taxes. But there's a second part to it that with this Roth conversion ladder that we're introducing of waiting 5 years, you don't need access to all 1 million in 5 years, right? Most people, they might be just pulling maybe 4 to 6% out of their investment account each year in retirement. So you don't need access to 100% within 5 years. You most likely just need maybe a single digit percentage of that account.
Right. In essence, what you need is to cover your annual expenses every year, right? Like that's the definition of FI, basically. Like we don't do any of this nonsense of like, my retirement is based on my current income and all this other shenanigans that is essentially meaningless. Like, okay, what is FI? We need to cover our life's expenses. Everything drives from that number, life expenses. Any of this other nonsense, it doesn't mean anything. We have to cover our life expenses. So that, hey, when you reach a point of FI and you say, I'm not going to work anymore, whenever that may be, that's what you need to cover year one, whatever your life expenses are. And we're using this 100,000 in this scenario. Again, year two, you need another 100,000. So we'll get back now to regularly scheduled programming, which is going back to bullet two of, okay, you've got this 5-year kind of seasoning period or baking period. I've always thought of it as seasoning, but I like the baking. That's better. It's a slow rise over 5 years.
And each conversion has its own oven that you have to close for 5 years, and it doesn't unlock until year 5.
That is exactly right. So yeah, on basically day zero, we decide, okay, we are going to convert. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, all of our traditional retirement savings are now in an IRA. So we have an IRA. Maybe we had 401ks, maybe we had 403bs, but we got them all into an IRA that we control, because that, in essence, is
Which
the
is very
starting.
typical.
Totally typical. You're not leaving necessarily the money at an old employer. You'd rather have control over it. So you need to do that for this strategy, but that's pretty typical anyway. So I guess my first question to you is, and I think in your scenario, they have $2 million saved up. I know I used the erroneous million, but I think 2 million was
Sure,
what you
sure.
started with.
Yeah, we'll make them a little fat fire today.
Yeah. Since we're saying that they spent 100 grand. So they have $2 million sitting in a traditional IRA. The question just very simply is, what is that first conversion amount that they would consider? Like, how do they think about that first conversion?
Yeah, I think before even thinking about the conversion amount, you have to think about what are the actual expenses that I'm trying to meet in 5 years or even this year, right? So we talked about beginning with an end in mind. I think first, before you even retire and do this, you have to think, okay, if I need 5 years of expenses, what defines expenses, right? I think a lot of us think like living expenses, right? Or after tax living expenses. But expenses might include things like inflation adjustments. You might say, if this family spends 100,000 today, like when they retire early, will that be inflation adjusted? Might they spend more in the early parts of early retirement than they do now? So I think it's really thoughtful. Again, you'll never get the number right. All we know is the numbers are wrong. But conceptually, you have to think ahead, what might my life look like when I retire early, and how might my investments become income to support those expenses? So inflation adjustments, early retirement lifestyle. So how might your lifestyle be different versus while you're working? And also, a lot of us have an emergency fund on the path to FI, but it could still make sense to have an emergency fund through FI. And that might be your deductibles for your homeowner's insurance. Things that insurance doesn't cover. For example, my sewage pipe broke and I had to spend $12,000 that they didn't cover. Like, emergencies will still happen even if you're financially independent. Of course, once you have an emergency fund set up, I start to call it an inconvenience fund because it's no longer an emergency. But you do have to think, wait a minute, if I only have 5 years of expenses saved up and an emergency happens, now I don't have enough to make it through the 5 years. So starting off with this idea, maybe your rule of thumb says, hey, instead of 5 years of expenses, maybe we buffer that and make it 6 years instead, just so that if the unexpected does happen, we'll not only be ready, but we won't be as anxious about it when it does happen.
I like that. I like that a lot. And yeah, saying 6 years is as arbitrary in essence as saying set aside an extra emergency fund. But I like the 6 years as just kind of a heuristic to use.
Yeah, but a 20% buffer per year for the 5 years.
Beautiful. I like that. And right, like you said, think about with the end in mind. So I think a lot of us just very simply say, oh, our expenses are X today. That's what it's going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Well, realistically, that's not the way life works. Like you said, Cody, sometimes people spend a little bit more in early retirement. Frankly, sometimes people spend less because some job expenses, commuting expenses went down. Maybe they go to one car. So it's important to take a close look at realistically what this looks like. And like you said, you have to factor in. I don't think most of us necessarily factor in inflation. And I also don't think most of us basically gross up the amount for the taxes that we have to pay to get down to the amount that we need to quote unquote spend, because we're not thinking about taxes as part of this. So I think that's something that's important to really, really slow down on.
Yeah, and let's talk about, I think that's the biggest missing piece when people talk about Roth IRA conversion ladders, is they say, I need 5 years of expenses, but they don't think about the tax liability that they'll have to pay to actually implement the conversions themselves.
Right. The tax liability on the conversion that they made.
Right. And this is a really important point to make. A lot of people think that when they do the Roth conversions, they'll withhold the tax from the conversion itself. But if you do that before 59 and a half, even though the conversion will not be subject to the 10% penalty, the withholding will.
Huh.
So it's actually important that the 5 years of expenses that you have set aside in a taxable brokerage, including checking and savings accounts, includes not only your living expenses, inflation adjusted and all those things, but also includes the estimated tax payments that you're going to have to make to pay for those Roth conversions.
Yeah, that is interesting. And in fairness, I think a lot of us haven't considered the taxable side because we're coming at it from like the ultra frugality FI side of saying, hey, look, if I have a mortgage paid off and my life costs $40,000, I'm going to be paying virtually zero in tax or very, very minimal, even just back of the envelope with the $29,200
Mm-hmm.
standard deduction for married filing joint. You're at 10,800 in taxable income, you're in the 10% rate, right? So like you're talking $1,000 in tax at that point. So that's small enough that it's a rounding error, and I don't think a lot of people consider it.
Like in the $100,000
You
environment,
have
you
to.
really will. Yeah, you have to think ahead. And when I say the 6 years instead of 5 years, that buffer included the Roth conversion taxes, at least federally. And I also looked at some states, but that buffer that I mentioned before of 6 instead of 5 years includes the buffer on the tax liability as well.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. And right, just for clarity's sake, that 5 or 6 years that Cody's talking about, that's the amount that you need in your taxable brokerage accounts to basically get you from your zero to when you can start actually pulling out this money that you've converted in this ladder effect. So really, it's like a multi-pronged thing. You're making the conversions and then paying the tax each year along the way, but you can't access that money for 5 years, and then the next year is, year one is 6 years, et cetera. But those first 5 years, you need money to pay for your life, obviously. So that's
Right.
why it's both the actual strategy of doing the conversion and getting that right, but having enough money to bridge those first 5 years.
So actually, to add a prong to that, because we like to go, a little bit into the weeds today's episode, maybe next episode we'll get back into 50,000 foot view.
Oh, we like the weeds. We like the weeds.
But I want to talk about too that one of the expenses, one of those 5 years of expenses that we have to think about is the cost of health insurance. And keep in mind, a lot of people say, well, in early retirement, my income will be at a level, I'll probably will get a fully subsidized healthcare with the premium tax credit. But keep in mind, to receive the premium tax credit, which is that subsidy through the health insurance marketplace, your income actually has a floor that it has to hit, not just a ceiling. So when you're doing these Roth conversions, not only are you thinking about setting up enough conversions to take out in 5 years for living expenses, but you also want to make sure those conversions are thoughtful in how they increase your modified adjusted gross income for calculating your premium tax credit. So if you're a family with lots of kids, sometimes you might actually have to convert a little bit more to actually be able to get those premium tax credits to begin with so that you can have either a low cost or no cost health plan.
Right. So yeah, there is this interesting interplay between the Roth IRA conversion, the amount that you convert as a taxable event, and the subsidies that you get when you buy one of these ACA plans, I guess ultimately through healthcare.gov. So right, in your example, when this married couple with no kids is pulling out and having that taxable event of $100,000 each year, just off the top of my head, that sounds like way too significant of an income to get fully subsidized. I know you dove into this, right?
Yeah. So yeah, diving into that, like this family distributing $100,000, as a conversion, not as a normal distribution. In this case, they're actually going to have to pay $66.50 for the year of health insurance, which again, maybe 500, $600 a month might not be too bad, but that's after receiving a premium tax credit of 7,600. So over half of their health insurance was covered by a subsidy, but they had to be thoughtful about the amount they convert to even get into the place of getting a tax credit to begin with.
Right. So, right. That's again, start with the end in mind. Depending on what your life situation is now, assuming this example couple, they might be getting heavily subsidized health insurance from their current company or companies. And while that's more than a 50% discount off of the rack rate, which unfortunately is over $14,000, it still is 6650, like you said, that they have to pay out of pocket just for the insurance premium. So for someone starting with the end in mind, can they go to healthcare.gov and mock up what a premium might be?
Absolutely. Without going too much into detail, if you go to measuretwicemoney.com/ChooseFI, there's actually a video that literally goes step by step on how to do this. So, based on your household income, size, location, and age, regardless of what time of the year it is, you can go ahead and actually kind of search around for plans to figure out what those subsidies might be and the plan cost. And also, like you mentioned, it's really thoughtful to say, hey, if we're going to retire in 10 years, how old will our kids be then? Because maybe they're actually at an age where they will no longer be on our health plan, which might actually decrease the amount we can get in subsidy because there's fewer people in the household. So I'll have a landing page ready for you, and Brad will put it in the show notes to make sure that you can watch additional videos on some of these strategies that are more detailed, including visuals for people who like to go beyond the audio.
Love it. And that's measuretwicemoney.com/ChooseFI. And we will have that in the show notes.
So we talked about this 10% penalty that is an exception that we're trying to avoid here with this Roth IRA conversion ladder. But also keep in mind, first of all, you could just take a normal distribution and be hit with that 10% penalty as a last resort, right? You still have access to that money, just pay a penalty. But I'm also going to quickly mention some other penalty exceptions that we might not have thought through. So again, before you dive into the Roth IRA conversion ladder, understand that there are some exceptions that we can consider. First of all, of course, once you're 59 and a half, you don't have to worry about that 10% penalty. A second one that's very popular within the FI community is called the rule of 55, which means if you separate from service, so if you terminate employment in or after the year you reach age 55, that's age 50 if you're a qualified public safety worker, by the way, that you can actually take normal distributions from that workplace retirement plan, right? That 401k or that 403b without the 10% penalty. With that said, there's a little caveat here that kind of drives me nuts, which is that when you distribute income, when you take a normal distribution from a workplace retirement plan, 401k, 403b, there's actually a mandatory 20% federal tax withholding on the amount you distribute. That doesn't mean that you'll owe 20% taxes, but it's going to require 20% withholding, which if you think about this from this perspective, let's say I need 100,000, right? If I need 100,000 out of my 401k, using the rule of 55, that means that I'm going to have to actually distribute $125,000. So even though I'm paying taxes of $8,000, I just was forced to withhold 25,000 of taxes.
That's incredible. And right, it is that important distinction. Since this is advanced FI, most people probably know this, but withholding is not liability. It's just held on account by the IRS, and that will then be put on as a payment on your tax return, and you can request the refund at that point. But nevertheless, like Cody just said, if you're doing this very specifically to cover a certain amount of expenses, to have to then gross that up for the tax that's annoyingly being withheld, essentially like against your will, that's really less than ideal.
Right. So the rule of 55 is great. I mean, a lot of people take advantage. Just keep in mind that mandatory withholding. Another penalty exception is up to $10,000 from a traditional or a Roth IRA, including the Roth IRA earnings, to buy, build, or rebuild a first home. And by first home, that's actually a home that if you have not owned a home within the past 2 years. So again, even though you see the phrase first home, it's really the first in the last 2 years. So again, that's pretty uncommon. But if let's say in early retirement, you want to buy, build, or rebuild a first home, quote unquote, you can take up to $10,000. That's not going to be subject to a 10% penalty if you take it as a normal distribution. After that, there's medical expenses that exceed 7.5% of your AGI. Medical insurance due to unemployment, which, when you retire early, we can't consider that unemployment, even though you're technically unemployed.
Yeah. How loose is the definition of unemployment?
Right, exactly. I am voluntarily unemployed for the next 40 years. Also, total disability and also inherited IRAs. So if you inherit an IRA from, let's say, your parents, for example, that will not be subject to a 10% penalty, even if you take money out of that before you're 59 and a half. And also, of course, inherited IRAs, they do have their own inheritance rules, whether it's a 10-year rule or stretched throughout your life. Just keep in mind that there's no penalty if you're taking money out of inherited, traditional, or Roth IRA. And then the last exception here I want to mention, that's actually my favorite, but it does have some inflexibility to it. We've mentioned before on the podcast, called substantially equal periodic payments, also known as SEPP. And that comes from tax code 72T. So if you hear somebody say 72T or SEPP, they're talking about the substantial equal periodic payments, which effectively, so the IRS designed retirement accounts they wanted to make sure they added some friction with that, that 10% penalty. What they didn't want is people taking money out of the retirement accounts before they actually retired. And the IRS doesn't know, right? So if you retire early at age 50, there's no test you can take to prove to the IRS that you're retired. And they're going to go, okay, the 10% penalty doesn't apply to you. You've proved that you're actually retirement ready. I wish they had a retirement ready quiz that you took to avoid the penalty. But instead, rather than having a retirement ready quiz that they force you to take, there's a strategy or method called SEPP, to prove to the IRS that you're actually using it for retirement. You're taking a substantially equal periodic payment, so typically an annual payment out of your retirement account for the longer of 5 years or until age 59 and a half. So this is very important. It's the longer of 5 years or until age 59 and a half. So if you're age 50 and you start periodic payments, you have to continue them at least for the 10 years, right? So you have to go beyond the 5 years because 59 and a half is a longer period.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, Sean, that was an eye-opening thing for me when he talked about that on 475, that I think a lot of us had heard about 72T for years, but for a multitude of reasons, it did not seem like a really viable strategy. And evidently, I think it was in 2022, something changed fairly dramatically to make it much more viable. And that, again, was a total eye opener that I think most of us just said, okay, 72T exists, but it's not real in essence. So Sean imparted that. And he also talked about an interesting thing where you can split your IRA into essentially as many sub IRAs as you want. And when
Right.
you split it, then you can put it very like granularly, decide how much money you get by running that 72T on that precise amount. And then you can always do more if you want by splitting the rest of the main money into another IRA. So, Cody, like I said, it was just a really cool thing that I had never considered before.
Yeah, and SEPP as like it became more popular when, like you mentioned, they actually raised like you have to reference what's called the federal midterm rate to figure out how much you can take. What's the maximum amount you can take out of that retirement account using this strategy? And they actually let you use the higher of the midterm rate or 5%, and that was a big deal when they increased it to 5. What's funny now is with the interest rates going back up, the 120% midterm rate that's used is actually higher than 5% now.
Oh, wow.
So it's actually kind of back to where the new normal, right? With that in mind, again, there's a lot more detail here, but I want to mention to you, some people worry about the amount that they can take out. Like they're worried that they might not be able to take out enough using this strategy. But based on the current midterm rate, using what's called the amortization distribution method, which is really the only one to consider, by the way, if you look at the three methods, it allows you to take the most amount of money out of the smallest account. So take the most amount of annual payments out of the smallest account balance wise, which I looked at from age 35 to 58 right now, based on, when we record this, in July 2024, that's up to around a 6 to 7% annual distribution rate. And with the amortization distribution method, what's really nice about it is the amount every year is the same. So you don't have to worry about like, oh no, did I take out the right amount this year? Just get the first year right and then keep taking
Right.
out that amount moving forward.
And yeah, that was also another one of the aspects that dissuaded people was it was said that the calculation is really difficult and blah, blah, blah. But I
You only
don't,
have to do it once.
yeah, you only have to do it
Correctly.
once. And I think that was severely overblown. I think, frankly, just like since people didn't really consider it viable, nobody really dove into just how difficult or not difficult it was. So, anyway, I'm glad we stopped on that because, again, this is an advanced episode. So, while that isn't exactly germane or pertinent to like the specific Roth IRA conversion, it is very important for this holistic picture of, hey, look, I've got all this money sitting here. What are the different ways that I can approach this? And it's nice to know that we have multiple ways now, which is really cool.
Right. And in that link I mentioned previously, for more viewing, I actually have a video that actually shows all of those early distribution strategies in more detail in video. And lastly, I just want to mention the last two penalty exceptions to avoid the 10% penalty are actually qualified higher education expenses for you, right? Parents, kids. There's special rules there for higher education expenses, and also qualified birth or adoption distributions, but it's only up to $5,000 per taxpayer. So just keep in mind, if there's like a unique thing you're using this money for outside of just normal living expenses, go ahead and check out the exceptions. If you want to look at the penalty exceptions in more detail, publication 590B is the IRS publication for more information.
Nice. That is very, very helpful. So let's get back to the actual conversion ladder. So I think we have painted the picture of you start with the end in mind. So you have to have a sense of, okay, what am I actually trying to cover here? And now we have all of our retirement money in IRAs and traditional IRAs. So that's the mechanism where we make this conversion each year. So we're doing that each year. Is there a recommendation in terms of do you do it on January 1st? Does it matter? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's actually great that it's a tax year thing. So keep in mind that to take normal distributions, I mentioned 59 and a half. That's actually based on the day you turn 59 and a half. Whereas what's nice about conversion ladders is you can do a Roth conversion on December 31st, and your 5 year clock actually starts the January 1st earlier of that year. So it's
Oh,
a
wow.
tax year conversion date. So even if you do a conversion at the end of the year, it's actually dated the first of that year. So
Interesting.
technically, it could almost be like a 4 year and 364-day holding period.
That is a great piece of information. So, okay, right. In that first year that you do it, it essentially doesn't matter when you make the conversion. I guess same for subsequent years, but in essence, you could do it on December 31st of 2024 and then January 1st of 2025. And the one that you made on December 31st of 24 would be backdated, whatever, 364 or 5 days earlier to January 1st, 2024. This is a leap year, so I guess it's 365. So January 1st, 2024. Now, is it 5 years from that exact date? So would it be January 1st, 2029 that seasoning period is over at that point? Would you wait until January 2nd just to be safe, or how do we think about
Yeah, it's per tax year. So if you did one December 31st of this year of 2024, it would be backdated technically to, January 1st is when your baking period starts, your holding period. So all of 2024, that's year one, right? 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028. So January of 2029 is when you can access your first conversion if you did one in 2024.
Okay. That is really great. So, right, you're making this conversion every year. And I guess there's an interplay now between how old you are and what you need to bridge to, correct?
Right. So, first of all, you have to have 5 years ready. But let's say that you're age 50, which means you actually have to make it 10 years. So, you have to have 5 years to start, but you might have to continue doing conversions for longer than 5 years.
Right. So, okay, when you say 5 years ready, that means you need 5 years of money in regular taxable brokerage accounts to bridge you. But in that case, you're making the conversions every year for 10 years, basically, right?
Right. Until 59 and a half, when that 10% penalty exception goes away, or when the
Right.
10% penalty goes away.
Right, because then at that point, you don't need to bridge anymore. It's just the amount that you pull out, you can utilize immediately then. Okay, so that makes sense. So I may have misspoken there, and we may have gotten it's hard sometimes thinking about in terms of how many years do you actually need to do this, because right, there's always that for but I think it's everyone can look at their own life and say, okay, I'm X age. The finish line is 59 and a half. I know I need the 5 years of taxable amount, and then how many years of these conversions do I need to make ahead of time? And then once I'm 59 and a half, it becomes a lot easier. But you actually added a really cool piece of nuance to a lot of people, because one of the big points of consternation, let's say, is okay, but how the heck, if I've been funneling all this money all this time into pre-tax accounts, how the heck do I have 5 years worth of expenses? And really, you've now made that more like 6 years, even though, again, you're just saying 20% extra. So 6 years is a cute way of thinking about it. But that might be hard for a lot of people. But you actually effectively taken a year out of that, if you really think about it. Because if somebody might now hear this and say, oh, you mean I can start this? I can stop my job in December. And then I actually only really need 4 years and a tiny little bit of amount to bridge, because again, it backdates all the way back to January 1st of that year. So that might actually inform in a weird kind of way. And I'm thinking about this off the top of my head, Cody, because this has
Yep.
never crossed my plate, or frankly, anyone's plate in the FI community. This actually does change it from potentially 5 years to, if we're really being strategic, and that's a concern. right? That's the most important caveat. And it's a concern. Well, you might actually only need 4 years, 4 years and a tiny little bit, plus your gross up, obviously.
Well, I think there's a caveat there, though, that typically the year you retire, you wouldn't want to add more taxable income on
Right. You'd have
top of what,
taxable income.
and you get your
Yes,
like
yes, yes.
your PTO and all this stuff that yes, it's typically your first Roth conversion will be the year after you retire, unless you like retired early in the year.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. And of course, I think you're absolutely right. But again, also, and why I think it's important to leave that in because again, this is and not edit something like that out because it wasn't a mistake. It's a this is a brainstorm, and I think that's what's cool about this,
Hmm.
Cody. Is okay, depending on what their exact situation is, maybe their expenses are dramatically lower than our $100,000 example, and maybe they have a whole lot more space in the 12% bracket. Well, maybe they do consider that then. Like there's always nuance. And I think whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, I think just having that as part of like open the aperture to, okay, this is yet another consideration. It might not be a smart consideration, frankly, but like I think it's an extra little piece of nuance that could be helpful for someone out there. So anyway, we'll put a bow on that and move on to so I was painting the picture again of all right, this is the holistic picture of you're making those conversions every year. You had the amount in your taxable accounts, but let's stop on that. And I want your expertise on that. So, a lot of people, the amount in their quote unquote taxable brokerage accounts, these are in, let's say, a Vanguard VTI, or it might be in Berkshire Hathaway or something like there are
Right.
potential tax consequences of that. So, let's talk through like that aspect because I think it's not just cash in all likelihood that's sitting there doing nothing.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of this that are really interesting. One, of course, is the dividend, interest, capital gain distributions that are going to add taxable income in those years. But also, do you invest that 5 years of living expenses plus the money to pay the taxes on the conversions? Do you invest that for growth or do you invest it for liquidity and stability? Because if we're talking about how important it is to have at least 5 years, what if that 5 years, in terms of, let's say you invested it in 100% equity, what if that 5 years turns into 4 years, right? And then, like, what are the potential consequences of those investments going down? And I just pulled up the historical risk and return metrics of the S&P 500 index, which is very similar to the VTSAX that a lot of us chill with. Over a 5 year period, invested in the S&P 500, going back to 1926, there have been 12 periods of the 94 periods that experience negative annualized returns. So if you're investing in equity over a 5 year period, historically there has been a chance of losing money over that period. I think a lot of us think that, oh, the S&P does maybe 8, 10%, but that's over very long periods annualized. So just keep in mind that historically there's been about a 13% chance, again, looking back, not
Right.
forward, of actually losing that bet. So my perspective is always to prioritize the ability to maintain your desired lifestyle above tax optimization.
Yep.
So what that means is if I have, again, this is just my own bias here, that if I have 5 years of living expenses, I'm going to invest that for short-term stability and then keep my other investments and my other accounts growing longer term. Because my focus here is to have enough liquidity and stability to make it the 5 years without having to break into another strategy, especially if you're prioritizing Roth conversion ladders.
Okay. I like the concept, but I want to get into like when the rubber meets the road. So, at what point do you start prioritizing not long term growth with that, but stability? Because presumably, I don't believe you're saying, okay, I'm on a 20-year path to FI, and on day one, any money
No,
that I
no,
have
no. Right,
extra,
right.
I'm not putting into VTI. So I'm actually focusing now on VTI more than VTSAX. I feel like VTSAX has become like this meme. And for most people, VTI is a slightly better option. So you're not saying stick it in your Globo Bank, savings account because
Yeah,
you obviously
not from
would
day one.
forego all that growth.
Right.
So at what point do you transition? Because there has to be a transition.
Yeah, that's a great follow up. So, my heuristic, again, I know that rules of thumb, again, they always say one size fits all, hardly fits anyone. With that said, I have my own heuristic here that says any money you expect to spend within the next 7 years, I'm putting that in fixed income. So, I start to think about adding, again, let's say somebody's 100% equity in their portfolio. I start thinking about adding fixed income to that portfolio starting when they're 7 years out to retirement.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're building up your 5-year ladder and you're 20 years out, like don't invest it for stability from the beginning. Start de-risking that portion when you're, within 5 to 10 years before you plan to retire.
Okay. And right at that point, that person will still be working. And there might be some additional tax consequences, naturally, right? Especially if there are unrealized long term capital gains. Depending on your tax bracket, there might be, and this will be another advanced FI episode we do, but there's a way potentially pay very little. But there is a significant amount of people that might pay 0% tax liability on long term capital gains up to a certain amount. But even still, and this is very important, long-term capital gains get a preferential tax rate. Okay, for most people, it's going to be 15%, right? So I think this is important that a lot of people hear the terminology and they think long capital gains, capital gains. Like I've heard so many people vilify this as a boogeyman when I want to shake them and say, you're getting a preferential rate. You are literally being showered with benefits for this. Just because it has this weird term doesn't mean it's something negative or nefarious. You're not paying at your top marginal bracket. It's not ordinary income. You're paying at this preferential rate. But nevertheless, Cody, if you're on a 20-year path to FI and you start de-risking 7 years out, depending on the particular lots of VTI that you decide to sell or the particular shares that you decide to sell, you may have bought those shares on day one and we're 13 years down the road. There might be a decent bit of unrealized long-term capital gains in there that you have to pay tax on. Now, naturally, this all kind of washes out in the sense that, okay, this is not just a math equation because realistically, that person would say they'd pay the tax. They wouldn't exactly it would just be part of life. They'd move on and then they'd realize, okay, maybe I need to work an extra 6 months. Like it wouldn't be this overt thing. It would just kind of wash itself out, is how I think about it. But now that I brought this up, I know you're vigorously shaking your head, which I love. And any additional nuance that you have?
Yeah, I think again it goes back to that prioritization. I have 3 levels of prioritization. And again, it's so important that you don't skip the line, right? So, starting with number 1, is my portfolio set up for me to be able to support my desired living expenses, right? So that might mean, for example, like hey, like not having all the money that I'm spending a year from now all invested in equity, right? Like focusing on stability and liquidity versus growth and income at certain points in your journey. Number 2 in prioritization is going to be diversification, right? Diversification to me means that your investments are going in different directions at different speeds. If all your investments are going the same direction at the same speed, if you're only invested in the S&P 500 and the total stock market index, it's like going to the grocery store and buying 2 bananas of different brands, right? Rather than buying an apple, a banana, a pineapple, right? Like diversifying. So the ability to meet your desired lifestyle, then diversification, then tax optimization. Do not let, oh no, the capital gain jump to number 1 in your line. And then that's the whole idea that people mention of letting the tax tail wag the dog, which we're probably tired of hearing about in our community sometimes. But just it's mentioned over and over again because it's so important. Don't let potential tax consequences run your financial plan and effectively run your life into retirement.
Yes. We cannot say that enough. Let's be clear. So this is really important. And one of my biggest pet peeves in the entire universe is like people who make suboptimal decisions based on some bizarro thought of like just not paying tax, as if it's something different. Like they get into just oddball territory and like they turn their brains off. And it's really frustrating. Sometimes it's just by lack of knowledge, and sometimes it's some aversion to paying tax or whatever it may be, but it's just so silly sometimes. Like there are people who still today say, I need a mortgage for the interest deduction so I can deduct it off my taxes. When any person who has some knowledge understands that, man, especially in this new era we're in with the massive standard deduction, most people cannot even come close to itemizing their deductions to get over, like we said, that 29,200 for married filing joint. And of course, Cody, we could have set this up for single. There's no preference for married filing joint. We picked one. We could have done head of household here for this entire thing. So anybody out there who's saying, oh, but I'm single, does this apply?
The
Of
concept
course it
works,
applies to
right?
you. It's the same damn thing. It's just like we can't do 4 of these in parallel. But that person who's saying like, oh, I need this interest deduction, right? Like even if by some miracle you're adding all of your itemized deductions and you get over the 29,200, you're only getting the benefit in essence for the amount over 29,200, and then you multiply by your marginal rate. So it's a tiny little baby benefit that you're getting, most people, for something like that. And then obviously you writ large on another one of my pet peeves is like a lot of these real estate investors who are like, I can never pay tax. I have to roll this forward forever. I need to like, I only have 90 days to do it, but come hell or high water, I'm going to find an investment. Like,
Step up and basis is everything.
right, it's so silly. And like, they make suboptimal decisions. And then you have intelligent real estate investors like Scott Trench and Chad Carson and Paula Pand, who counsel, in essence, the opposite of that, of just like, all right, let's let the tax tail not wag the dog and let's make the right decision financially. And obviously, you don't want to be unaware of the taxes,
Right.
clearly, in any of these cases. We're not arguing that. But for most people, you're getting a much smaller tax benefit on a lot of things than you've been led to believe. So rant over, and I'll let it get back to you now.
Yeah, and a good reminder, like today, like this whole episode was focused on optimizing the top 10%, not the 90%. That's so important to get right. Get the 90% right. The 10% is what we're talking about. And ironically, we're talking about how to avoid the 10% penalty, right? If a 10% early withdrawal penalty will not allow you to retire, you might not be ready.
Ooh, Cody, I love that. That is like the quote of the century. I want to like emblazon that on our website or something. That is amazing. Okay, I think we're coming in for a landing here. So let's talk about maybe other early retirement income sources, because I wonder if there's some interplay here. A lot of people still might have that question of those first 5 years, and that's the last question that I have for you as of now. And I'll let you kind of run into this other income sources. So I guess when people think about those first 5 years, which now we're in essence saying is six, is how we should think about it. A lot of that is going to be in equities, though, like you said, maybe over that 7 year prior period, you're kind of slowly getting out. Some people might have an emergency fund or might be, in this day and age, might have money in a high yield savings or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. That's not unrealistic. The one consideration we brought up before was, what about if you have Roth IRAs that you've been contributing to over the years? Like you talked about those 10 years, you could have $59,500 per person. Is that a viable strategy for bridging those first 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great point. Earlier, we talked about this 5 year or 6 year and all those strategies there. But let's say that, in retirement, maybe your withdrawal, your tax free and, penalty free withdrawal of your direct contributions, it's not that you can choose which ones come first. Like those come first. Like those come first before you take your conversion money out. So yeah, if you or you and your spouse, partner have been contributing to your Roth IRA, either directly or using like maybe backdoor, like those non-taxable contributions, like you could have over, maybe one or two of your 5 years covered by your Roth IRA withdrawals, which by the way will not increase your taxable income at all. So you could actually take your money back out of the Roth IRA that you put in directly that meets your living expenses and still have the full breadth of conversions available to you so that your 5 years actually feels more like 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that is really, really important. So, right, they're completely distinct in this case. So, we're talking about the contributions that you made all along the way every year if you had been contributing to your Roth IRA. So, okay, that's important. So that counts as part of this 5 year bridging. But how else should we think about other early retirement income sources?
Yeah, I think most people I've worked with, 100 plus people, to and through retirement, the Roth IRA conversion ladder usually isn't the only source of retirement income. So I'll mention a few others, including some that are kind of unique. One is reimbursing yourself from your HSA, right? So in the FI community, we might have been, again, a lot of us are learning about it new today, but example, like my wife and I, we have about $50,000 in our HSA that is invested for long-term tax-free growth for future reimbursement. Maybe if there's a year where like something happens and we need a little bit more income, but we don't have to start, the substantial equal periodic payments or take extra out of a different account. That's kind of like another form of emergency fund. We don't necessarily want to take it out of there, but at least the HSA is available as one of those last resorts. So reimbursement for prior qualified medical expenses, or of course in the current year. Also, private or public pensions. A lot of us talk about how pensions are going away, but there are still a lot of people with pensions. So just keep in mind that public and private pensions could start sometimes you may be in 50, kind of in your mid 50s typically if you do have a pension. There's an awesome account, right? 457B distributions. They do not have a 10% early withdrawal penalty. effectively, kind of my tinfoil hat here says the 450B includes government employees. So the government, in a way, kind of set themselves up, for themselves. Because as you imagine, a lot of people who work in government, they can't be a senator their whole life, right? So that's an opportunity for government and also other like nonprofit. They might offer a 457B, which does not have a 10% early withdrawal penalty. With that said, do not move that 457B to an IRA because you would lose that opportunity. It has to stay in the 457B. So again, it's not my favorite, but it's still an opportunity.
But just to be clear, so when you pull out of a 457B, there's not the 10% penalty, which is wonderful, but it's still a taxable event because the money went in pre-tax, right?
That's right. Yeah. So
Okay.
taking a normal distribution, assuming they allow partial distributions, 457B. Next is, of course, an inheritance, whether it's a taxable or non-taxable inheritance. So whether you inherit an IRA or just inherit taxable brokerage assets. Other would be rental real estate, right? So a lot of the listeners might have income coming their way, your net real estate income to help support their own living expenses. And also, one thing we haven't talked too much about is what about an early retirement? What if you end up selling your house? Right? You sell your house and either rent or buy another house. Maybe you specifically, when you sell your house, keep some of that net cash as part of your cushion to get through the 5 years. Let's say somebody sells their house 2 years before early retirement. They should be thinking ahead for, hey, should I hold on to some of this liquidity for that 5 year period? And then lastly, not just selling your house, but maybe you sell other assets that are appreciated just to give yourself a little bit more liquidity for the first 5 to 6 years.
Hmm. Yeah, the selling your house is an interesting one. And I guess it depends where you are. Like, let's assume you still have mortgage payments, right? So I'm thinking most people do not consider their home equity as part of their 4% rule. Clearly, in my estimation, it should be part of your net worth, but it doesn't. If that money is just sitting there in the walls of your home, you're not able to utilize it for early retirement, in essence, to cover your expenses. But right, if you take a scenario where, okay, I've had this mortgage locked up for 20 years, but I'm still paying on it, well, I might be able to sell that house, then take all of that equity. That might be my 5 years. And then
Right.
even if I'm renting an apartment or a condo or whatever, or another house, it might be comparable to what my mortgage payment was previously, especially when you add in all the extra factors. Because, right, I'm envisioning a scenario where someone's saying, well, look, guys, that doesn't really help me because I had paid off my mortgage and my expenses are predicated on having a $0 living expense in essence. And now you're saying, okay, I need to get pay rent every month. Well, obviously, then start with the end in mind. You would have to factor for that. But for most people haven't been in their houses for 30 years and paid off their
Right.
mortgage. So that actually might be a viable strategy to bridge those years that you need.
Yeah, and I'll mention all of my financial planning client meetings are actually on YouTube to watch. And there's actually a video, we can put in the show notes, but there's actually a financial planning meeting with a client named Jamie. Her real name, real numbers, all on YouTube for you. She's completely vulnerable and transparent with the numbers, but she specifically sells a house that had a mortgage and buys a new house, but it actually provided an additional $290,000 of liquidity for her to
Huh.
support her living expenses in early retirement. So
Wow.
again, it'll just show you one example of how you could possibly sell a house or sell a condo, relocate, whether it's renting or buying a new house, and maybe not locking up everything. And keep in mind, even with 7+% interest rates, just keep in mind, like it might be worth, again, sometimes that liquidity might be worth the higher interest rate, at least temporarily. And then maybe once you get to 59 and a half, right, maybe you can start being more aggressive with paying off that new mortgage that you had to get in early retirement.
I love that. In essence, there's always nuance, but having these different options at least gives you something to think about for your particular situation, right? We can never cover everyone's situation on a podcast like this, but I think we've done a pretty wide ranging job of explaining this in a lot of detail, Cody. So is there anything else? And I know in your document here you have some information on like tax reporting. I think that's outside the scope of what we could talk about here, but any final words on the Roth IRA conversion ladder or anything we haven't talked about or you want to sum it up?
Yeah. So a lot of listeners might be saying, okay, to get 5 years ready for early retirement in my taxable brokerage account, that would mean foregoing maxing out my pre tax workplace retirement plan, or that would be foregoing my HSA. I would actually tell you again, like, I'm not your advisor, like, this isn't just for you, but it would be very hard for me to give up that tax deferral only for the sake of building up your funds for creating ladders. So even though we focus a lot on it, the Roth IRA conversion ladder is still, to me, typically secondary to maximizing your tax deferral. So if you feel like I don't have extra money to put money into taxable brokerage accounts, it might still make sense for you. Again, not advice for you in your specific 2 ears listening, but for the most part, I'm actually finding that it would still make sense for somebody to take advantage of maxing out their pre-tax accounts. Again, assuming they're going to have a much lower effective tax rate in retirement. Don't get too caught up in building up taxable brokerage if you're having to forego some tax deferral. So just keep in mind that even though we talked about these Roth IRA conversion ladders, that isn't the only option, and you don't have to like. You can still call yourself a member of the FI community even if you don't have a Roth conversion ladder happening for you. It's
Yeah.
not a mandatory requirement to be part of the community.
Oh, I love that. I hope people know by now there's no requirement to being part of the FI community. That's what's beautiful about this is there are so many different flavors of FI. I think it is just about living an intentional life and getting to a point where you are financially independent. You have a significant amount more power on your side of the court, and however that works for you. Frankly, there might be many people listening to this, Cody, who never get to the definition of FI, but their lives are still dramatically better for having found the FI community, having found you, having found ChooseFI. And I don't want anybody to walk away feeling deflated in that sense. I think that again is what's beautiful is this is a wonderful option. And I think it's one of those things that it's like a feather in someone's cap. If they're able to pull this off and they're able to do this, and even more still, like the prototypical example of I paid zero tax, right? Like I got the tax deduction on the front side, I paid zero tax because my life was so inexpensive. And like, yeah, that's cool. But I mean, out of every 1,000 listeners, how many people are actually doing that? One, maybe zero,
Right.
one, two, three, something minimal. So let's put it in perspective and say that's why Cody set this up with the example of the 100,000, which is this still works. And we didn't dive into all the nuance of his precise example, but just that it works with a very minimal effective tax rate, even with someone with $100,000 of expenses. And that's a pretty cool way of looking at this. I think a lot of us are going to have dramatically lower expenses annually than that. And that just makes it easier still on both sides, right? In the sense that you're paying less tax and you need a smaller pot of money to bridge those first 5 years. So there's always this interesting thing when your expenses are lower, even along the path to FI, for every dollar less of expense that you spend every year, okay, it makes my FI number lower, but it also gives me more to put into my investments every year. So it gets me to FI quicker on both sides, which is actually a really interesting way of looking at it. So, Cody, I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you taking
Oh,
all
thanks
this
so
time. I
much.
think we did a really, really good job here. And just like always, there's going to be additional nuance. We can always hop on another one. If anybody has feedback, undoubtedly we left something out. Undoubtedly there's additional nuance. We always take feedback at choosefi.com. Give us something. I can add it in on a future roundup. I can put it in the newsletter, or Cody and I can jump back on another episode. And things are always changing in the fight community, but this is really just wonderful and up to date now. So, Cody, again, thank you. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so it's funny. My trademark for Measure Twice is keep finance personal, which is really what you're talking about. Is everybody has a personal path to and through FI. So to find me and additional educational resources, you can go to measuretwicemoney.com. I also have the Measure Twice Money YouTube channel, which actually you can watch real financial planning with real clients. And Brad and I, again, just maybe a little hint in the future, we might be doing one of these real life case studies with video and audio for the ChooseFI community specifically. So more to come on that.
Yeah, I love that you dropped that. We've been talking about that for a while. I think we are definitely going to make that happen. And that could be a really fun series and resource going forward for ChooseFI. So to be continued on that. But yeah, Measure Twice Money. And we'll have all the links that we mentioned in the show notes. And as always, thanks for being part of the ChooseFI community. And thanks for being here.